I'm happy to, although I'm not sure I have much more to add than the previous two.
They were good, yeah.
They were. I mean, I think there was lots of reasons or discussion about, what's the point of data in this, and many ideas were pointed out. And next slide, I guess. I tried to forward it on my own computer, and that didn't work. So similar to what other people have said is, why are we, measuring? What's the purpose of measuring? And certainly it can create tension for change. Once you go through the stages of, data reality, where you might deny it first and then say, well, it's maybe true, but it's somebody else's problem, and then finally you say, okay, maybe I have an issue and need to work on it. So it can create that tension for change, or show us where we need to do our work. Obviously, it can help us focus our teams. So we do a lot of work in our practices, and improving things or not, we don't really know because we really haven't measured. So for me, that's one of the key things, really helping to focus our teams on, if we're making all these changes, we need to make sure that they're actually an improvement. Otherwise, we're doing a lot of busy work for no reason. That third question of, are the changes an improvement? Next slide. So we talk about, for practices, and I think this has been mentioned, whenever possible, the data collection needs to be as easy and simple, tacked on to things that are already being collected, getting it from sources from your colleagues at CCNC or wherever. If you're collecting it with simple instruments, is there another question you might be asking that you can just tack onto that? Whenever possible, to connect it to the current workflow will make it the easiest. So you want a limited number of measures, but broadly representative of what you're trying to accomplish, depending on answering that first question, what are we trying to accomplish? Next question, next one. As others have said, it needs to be meaningful and understandable to the target audience. Because if it's meaningful and understandable to us, but not to who's receiving it, it's not going to be helpful to them. We want to include, whenever possible, outcome process and that balancing measure. What have we worsened? And I think that's always something we want to talk to our practices about, and we talk about it in teams. Okay, we want to do this, but what could we make worse? And make sure that we're kind of keeping an eye on that, because that can derail a project pretty quickly if we don't keep an eye out for that unexpected consequence. We want some of our measures and our data to be linked to the changes that we're trying to test and make. And it's important when we do this that our baseline levels aren't too high or too low. So go ahead. Meaningful and understandable. So is immunizations more important to a practice, or TB screening? So again, that audience. And then understandable, there is a very complicated continuity index that researchers use that you could say our patients are getting good continuity, but would we as practice people understand that? Probably better is the percent of patients seen by their PCP. So meaningful and understandable are important. Go ahead. Again, I said this, the global, the process balancing measures, are we improving some parts at the expense of the other? Go ahead to the next one. Link to key changes. Just an example, open access was really about the process, and one of the key changes was reducing the backlog. So can you measure that? Were you able to reduce your backlog? So the clinician's delays for appointments would be one way to reflect that. Go ahead. And then we talk about feedback. So what are we trying to accomplish? Do we know a change is an improvement? But then when we feed it back to the practices or to our team, within our own team, does everybody on the team perceive it as valid? And especially by the leaders that we may be reporting to. Timeliness of feedback is also important, and then benchmarking. Use operational definitions and detailed instructions for collecting that data, and that way when people ask, well, how did you collect it? Well, did you include this patient? Well, what about that patient? You can give them that information if needed. Measures, when possible, that are based on or consistent with nationally recognized guidelines, and sometimes there aren't any, so then you're really just benchmarking against yourself in a sense. Certainly there's guidelines that come out around different types of care, ADHD care, asthma care, and pediatrics, for example. And so while there may not be a benchmark, you can relate it to the guidelines. Are we doing that? And if you're developing a new measure, make sure you test it as always. We found that when we worked with teams that it's that timeliness is very, very important. In many of the collaboratives, I think we've tried to get it back within 10 days to 2 weeks, so that they could then use it. If we were the ones, the holders of the data, to get it back to them so they could use it to see if their changes are making an improvement. More delayed data is very difficult to really use in the short run and make meaningful change in a quick fashion. Now, in a team that's doing their own data collection, the turnaround time may or may not be as big of an issue, but you want to, as a team, say, can we get our data and so that we can look at it by the next meeting, which if the next meeting is 2 weeks. So we try and keep that 2-week time period. Go ahead. Again, other people have talked about this. Measures should have goals. National benchmarks can be useful. The one caveat to that I always say is that if our national benchmarks are kind of average or mediocre, then resting at meeting that national benchmark, we shouldn't stop there. We shouldn't say, oh, great, we've reached this benchmark, but that benchmark really isn't that good. And we sometimes, I think, get lulled into that complacency where, well, we've met this benchmark. So I like them, but with a caveat and of always being a little bit suspicious of them. And if there's multiple teams that you're working with, as we are here in Impact, it can be so helpful to require those teams to share their data with each other, because then it's really gives you another benchmark within like practices or like areas of work, so that if there is no national, that gives you your own benchmark. Go ahead. So here was just some examples of measuring key changes. So those run charts again, this was one on delay for third appointments, and you can see in about 5 months' time this practice was able to see that they were trending in the right direction and getting down to their goal. Their goal was 0 days for a delay of appointments, and they got down from 80 to 0 days in about 5.5 months. So that told them that they were on the right track, obviously. And then, as you can see, the sustainability, they were able to sustain it. Next one. And then just again an example about looking at and reading and displaying our data, how useful it can be when you can annotate it. And I know you've talked about this before, but this team could say, okay, and especially for next year, because this was a flu shot for cystic fibrosis patients, it took about 16 weeks and they got close to their goal, but they didn't get to their goal. What could we do next year to compress that down to 8 weeks? Well, by annotating it, they can see where they got their most improvement out of, and then they might be able to start those sooner, or even potentially all at the same time if some of those changes might move them sooner. So being able to display our data, and I really think that we've got to talk about our data at every team meeting. That's another key feature of how we use it. So, and that's why I love the key driver diagram, especially Richard's that he showed us last time, where you can pull that out. It's got your aim, it's got your goals, it's got your measures, and then it has your roadmap of what you're testing, and you can talk about your data at all different levels. Here's our PDSA data that starts and stops with that cycle. We're not going to report it all along, but here's what it told us, and this is what we're doing with those PDSA cycles. And then the next level of data on your secondary drivers, and then your primary, and then your outcome. But we can talk about it from that whole key driver diagram, and it really should be talked about at every single meeting. If we've had a meeting where we haven't discussed our aim and our goals and our measures and what data we have, then we really, in my estimation, haven't had a very useful meeting.